What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Colin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly, for now, with a Philly Sports Talk podcast. Take a look at the podcast feed. You'll see a ton of great guests we've had recently, like John Kincaid, Marissa Magnotta, and Zach Berman. All those interviews you can check out in past episodes. But we're on to the 12th episode now, and we're here to talk about Red October. I think the Phillies are the most complete team in Major League Baseball, and I have two articles coming out on 97.5thefanatic.com this week. The first one, why the Phillies will win the World Series. The second one, why the Phillies won't win the World Series. And I'm going to get to those, the depth of which each one is about, explaining how things could go right this October for the Phillies and how things could go wrong. But first, I want to talk about Fanatic Fan Fest. That's 97.5 The Fanatic's signature event that happens every year. It's changed times of the year a couple times now, but it just occurred this Saturday on September 28th. And yes, that was 1 week after Barbecue, which we talked about with Marissa Magnotta last week. But Andre Drummond of the 76ers was the featured guest at FanFest. That guy is a great personality. Right after he came back to the Sixers as a free agent this summer, he talked on The Fanatic with Bob Cooney at the time. He talked about how the circumstances when he left the Sixers the first time, and that was in the Ben Simmons trade, by the way, it really cut his time short in a place where he belonged. And I know a lot of people said right after Drummond signed that Sixers fans had been asking for him pretty much the whole time he was gone. I think that's absolutely true. And Drummond, he's a big dude. He's about 6'10", built like a house, but really colorful personality, real positive aura, I would think, a people person, crowd pleaser type. So it was fun to have him, but I think the real highlight is the celebration of the station. 97.5 The Fanatic's a workplace that I'm really lucky to ever be at, to sit in an area where you talk sports for a living, for me to do all this digital content for a living. It's humbling sometimes to think that that's what my life is about on a daily basis, and FanFest, such a big event where people come out, is a good reminder of that. And it's just all the hosts having a good time, listeners getting to experience things firsthand. That's what we talked about with Marissa Magnotta last week, the intimacy of what the listeners feel. And that's really what makes the medium what it is today. I wanted to play a clip for everybody, and this was on the main stage at Xfinity Live at FanFest. Andrew Salchunas introduced all the hosts, and he saved someone for last. Somebody that pretty much everyone listening is probably already familiar with. Take a listen to what Andrew Salchunas said.
All right, last but not least, you guys know this business. It's funny. Time to get real for a second. We see a lot of friends come and go, but sometimes the crazy thing about this business is friends come back. People say that Yankee Stadium is the house that Ruth built. 97.5 The Fanatic is the radio station that this next man built. Everybody please welcome back Mike Missanelli!
Well, it's been a long time. I gotta tell you, I really missed you guys. I missed talking to you for 2 years and 2 months or whatever it was. We're having a lot of fun with the new show. I hope everybody's liking the new show. And I plan to have fun today because I know starting Tuesday or next week when we do the show, I gotta put up a Bill Colarulo ripping why the Phillies didn't make a trade at the trade deadline. So I'm gonna have some fun today, drink some beers. Glad to be back. I'm happy to be back. I'm happy you guys are listening to the show. Tell your friends and neighbors, because I think we have a fun show. With Ray and Bill, I know how to mess with both of them already. It's only been a month. So thanks a lot. Thanks for coming to FanFest. I really miss you guys. We'll talk. All right? Take care.
It's good to have the established veteran back at 97.5 The Fanatic. Mike Missanelli's a giant of radio. I listened to him for years and years before I ever even got hired by The Fanatic. And that reference that Andrew made to the house that Ruth built, it was very representative of the event and this idea of a return for a giant like Mikey Miss. So I was real happy that everything turned out so well on Saturday. Another long Saturday afternoon that'll kick your butt, just like Barbecue did over at the concert in Camden. Another great day at Xfinity Live celebrating one of these stations. But on a show that's dropping on October 1st, I think there's one thing on the listeners' minds, and that's the Phillies as they head into Red October. And I'm going to start by talking about the positive. I've said pretty much all season long that I think this is a World Series team. They entered with that goal. Dave Dombrowski took everything seriously, trusted this group after that terrible loss to the Arizona Diamondbacks in the NLCS last year. The players have delivered the same message the entire season, and I bought into it because I saw that excellent start they had early in the year to get that huge lead in the NL East. And I've been pretty positive even through the down times. I've been pretty confident that the Phillies were going to bounce back even through that slump in late July, early August when they had lost, I think it was 7 series in a row. But I still felt good because I believe in the talent of this team. I thought they were going through a rough stretch in the middle of a very long season. But there are plenty of reasons for optimism, and I wanted to talk about them both in my article and on this episode. The one at the top of my mind, Zach Wheeler is the best pitcher in Major League Baseball. He finished towards the top of the majors in pretty much every statistical category. Chris Sale won the supposed triple crown of pitching this year for the National League. That's wins, strikeouts, and ERA. But first of all, wins really aren't that important to judge Major League pitchers anymore. They might have been a long time ago, but even then it was a pretty flawed concept. But Wheeler is right at the top behind Chris Sale in all of those categories. I listed the MLB ranks because I don't really believe in separating things by league anymore. Interleague play has expanded so much, and it's almost like in other sports by separating things from conference to conference. You don't really have that. Baseball used to do it because of more traditional schedules where American League teams and National League teams wouldn't really face each other. But let's face it, now it's really a way to juke the stats. But Zach Wheeler, third in the majors in ERA, third in WHIP, second in opponent's batting average, and that's at 192. There's only 3 pitchers in the game who held opponents under 200. Zach Wheeler's one of them. He's also tied for third in strikeouts. He's fourth in innings pitched, and he's third in F-WAR. That's Fangraphs, if you're not familiar with WAR. Chris Sale and Tariq Skubal are the only starting pitchers in the majors ahead of him. So Zach Wheeler also has the postseason experience to back it up. He's got 10 postseason starts, 11 games. Remember, he did come in relief in Game 7 of the NLCS last year. But he's been excellent in his postseason experience. 8 of those 10 starts were quality. The only 2 were the 2 games he pitched in the World Series in 2022. Remember, he really ran out of gas down the stretch that year. So we did have those 2, I'll put it mediocre starts, because remember, he could have stayed in Game 6. There was that whole controversy. But I do think Zach Wheeler is the best pitcher in the postseason. He's going to be the ace, the Game 1 starter for the Phillies, and I think he's the perfect guy to ride through Red October. Behind him, I think you still have the most capable 1, 2, 3. Aaron Nola is your second best starter, whether he starts Game 2 or not. They have a decision to make with Christopher Sanchez because his home splits were so good this year, road splits not so good. So you might use him in Game 2 at Citizens Bank Park, push Aaron Nola to Game 3 on the road. Probably depends who you play, if it's a left-handed heavy lineup, right-handed heavy lineup. But the Phillies will find that out this week as the Mets and Brewers series drags on. Behind Sanchez and Nola, and here's an issue that we're going to get to a little bit later, but you have Ranger Suarez. You are going to need 4 starters in all of these series this postseason. In the NLDS, CS, and the World Series, the schedule falls to where you are going to need 4 starters. Now, Ranger Suarez did not pitch well down the stretch this season. He had that long absence in late July and then all the way through into towards the end of August. And then when he came off the IL in August, he was ineffective all the way through his last start. The reason I'm still confident in the starting rotation, even though they need to use 4, I think Ranger Suarez has a really short leash. I don't think they're going to actually send him to the bullpen, but I think they're going to let him go once through the order, maybe twice through the order, and that's not too far off from his postseason starts in the past, actually. But Rob Thompson has deployed his bullpen pretty aggressively the last 2 postseasons, so I think Ranger Suarez is going to have very minimal expectations as that 4th starter. But we'll get to that in the second section because it is a concern and a reason the Phillies might not win the World Series. Their best pitcher in the first half of the season is either not healthy or not throwing very well. Let's move on to the bullpen, though, and this is one of the key points that I've been stressing for the last month that I haven't heard too many other outlets talk about. You have Matt Strahm, Jeff Hoffman, and Orion Kerkering in probably the best rhythm of all of their careers. You have Jose Alvarado and Carlos Estevez also at the back of the bullpen. Alvarado is going to be your top lefty, Estevez your top righty, and probably your closer. I mentioned Thompson likes to deploy the bullpen aggressively. He might also use guys pretty uniquely. Alvarado with a pocket of lefties, Hoffman with a pocket of righties. Whatever is the biggest spot in the game, he likes to use his best guys. So I'm confident in that group of 5 relievers. It's Strahm and Alvarado, the lefties, Estevez, Kerkering, and Hoffman, the righties. But the thing I have been stressing, and this is just a strange thing to think about, look at this bullpen compared to the bullpen that made it to the World Series in 2022. David Robertson, first of all, was one of the best high-leverage guys on that team. They threw in Zach Eflin pretty much in a closer's role at the last minute going into the postseason to clinch the division and also use him in the early rounds to close. And then if you look at the 2022 World Series stats, you'll notice that Connor Brogdon, Brad Hand, Nick Nelson, and Andrew Bellotti all pitched, and Noah Syndergaard got a start. That roster is so underwhelming compared to the pitching that they have now, and it reminded me of something that happened back in the golden era of Phillies baseball, as we like to call it, 2007 through 2011. When we think of that stretch, a lot of times one of the first things that comes to mind is the 4 aces. It's Roy Halladay, Cliff Lee, Cole Hamels, and Roy Oswalt, and they were a great starting staff. Part of the dominance of those teams was how they were built on starting pitching. But what not everybody really thinks of right away is that those guys weren't there for all 5 division championships. If you look back at the 07 and 08 teams, yeah, they had Cole Hamels coming up, but they relied heavily on guys like Jamie Moyer, Kyle Kendrick. In 2008, Cole Hamels was the dominant starter, the World Series MVP on that run, but their second best starter in that run was probably Joe Blanton. So it was a little different earlier in that run, and now that they have another prolonged stretch of playoff appearances, I feel the same way about the bullpen. You had a good roster with these star players in 22, like Bryce Harper, Kyle Schwarber, all this group, but they've added around it. Dave Dombrowski has built a really good bullpen, and he's added other pieces like Trey Turner, and he's solidified this entire roster. So when you compare those bullpens, thinking about how the Phillies went on deep playoff runs the last 2 years. And of course, Craig Kimbrell was a big part of the collapse against Arizona last year. But they have a much better bullpen now. So I think Phillies fans should feel much safer. And if you think back to the last couple of years, the tensest moments of playoff baseball are in the late innings. I think you have guys on the mound who you can trust. And of course, it's always going to be nerve-wracking. That's kind of the point. That's why it's so exciting. But there are some guys back there that I think are as good as anybody. And I know the Phillies' bullpen ERA wasn't actually that great this year. They slipped down to 14th in the majors by the end of the year. But when I saw that stat, I figured I needed to look a little deeper into it. And I think a lot of these stats get skewed by guys who aren't really going to throw many high-leverage innings during the postseason. And I think that's what happened to the Phillies. If you just go industry consensus all the way across MLB circles, you'll hear that the Yankees don't really have a well-defined bullpen right now. They're actually 6th in ERA. Phillies are 14th, and everybody's more confident in the Phillies there. So I don't think that stat really defines who they are, and I'm confident in the guys at the back end to do their jobs this postseason. I think it's going to be a strength of the team. One thing I will get to in the second section also is Carlos Estevez, who came over at the MLB trade deadline, but I have some minimal concerns about him. Going around the horn here to the strengths of this team, I think the offense and the lineup depth is right up there. Phillies finished 5th in runs scored this year, 5th in average, tied for 4th in OPS, and 7th in home runs. They're a top-tier MLB offense. They're up near the league leaders in every major offensive statistical category. The problem with that statement, though, I'm saying 5th, 4th, 7th. Who's ahead of them? Teams like the Yankees, the Orioles, the Dodgers. Problem with that, you might face those teams, so you might actually face an offense that's been better throughout the 2024 season. One thing I think the Phillies have a little bit of an advantage with, though, I think they have lineup depth. Other than the outfielders, Brandon Marsh and Johan Rojas, who will also be in the weakness section, I think this lineup is very good depth, 1 through 7. And I think the Dodgers are a little bit more top-heavy. The Yankees, you could say that too. They have Aaron Judge and Juan Soto, who are overpowering, threatening, intimidating, whatever you want to say, but they don't have the same amount of lineup depth as the Phillies. The Dodgers, their 1 through 5 is probably better than anybody. I think the Phillies stack up deeper into the order there. So while I don't think that they have the best offense in the majors, I'm going to stand by what I said, that they're the most complete team in the majors, and I think they can rival any of these hitting teams like the Yankees, Orioles, or Dodgers that finished ahead of them in the major offensive categories. One more advantage that the Phillies have, I believe, over the last couple of postseasons when they've gone on deep runs, and a reason that I think they're better equipped for the playoffs this year. Take a look at who made the final out of Game 7 of the NLCS last year. It was Jake Cave. That was their threatening bat off the bench. Jake Cave. And Rob Thompson even admitted during a series back in June when the Diamondbacks came to Citizens Bank Park that the one decision that maybe he regrets is that he should have pinch hit for Johan Rojas in the early innings of Game 7. But Jake Cave was his best option off that bench. This year, if he needed a pinch hitter for somebody like Rojas, he could turn to Cody Clemens. He can play the outfield. Weston Wilson, he can play the outfield also. Brandon Marsh is probably going to start in left. So if you want to pinch hit for Rojas in the 6th, 7th inning, move Brandon Marsh over to center. He's got a lot more flexibility with this bench. Rob Thompson has praised his AAA staff all season because it seems like when the Phillies call somebody up, that player immediately ends up getting a big hit somehow. But Cody Clemens and Weston Wilson were pretty much the two best, I'll say, throughout a majority of the season. Weston Wilson had good numbers against left-handers, and Cody Clemens has really got some power. And one thing I think about Clemens, he tends to come up in clutch spots. So while that's not something that's going to define an MLB regular season, guys coming off the bench, it actually can define a postseason because we've seen one at-bat change the course of history. So if a pinch hitter comes up one time and does something that Johan Rojas or Brandon Marsh can't do, maybe it turns into the Matt Stairs urban legend. You could see that this year from a guy like Clemens or like Wilson. And I also think that this versatility that Rob Thompson gets off the bench, it helps the team's overall defense because he feels free to put a guy like Wilson, who's not the greatest fielder, in there at a certain point, but with an extra man on the bench, we do expect, you can maybe put a defensive replacement in there for him at a different point in the game. The Phillies were actually an above-average baseball defense this year. They finished 14th in the majors, .7 DRS, that's according to Fangraphs. But they were one of 14 teams over the zero median. So 16 teams fell below that median this season. Phillies were above average. If you heard that a couple of years ago, you probably wouldn't have expected it to be true. But the Phillies were above average defensively in 2024. After we come back from the break, we'll talk about some potential weak spots entering Red October.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. The first half of the show, I talked about why the Phillies should be confident entering Red October and their chances to win the World Series. But in this segment, I'm going to go on the flip side. I'm going to talk about why the Phillies might not win the World Series. Some potential weaknesses that could get in their way of this goal they set out for in 2024. The first one, and I think I'm reading everybody's minds to say that this is the top concern, offensive volatility. You saw this burn them last year. They lost to the Diamondbacks 4 of the final 5 games because they started striking out at an alarming rate. The D-backs stopped throwing stuff in the zone. There were these red-hot Phillies hitters beat them 10-0 in Game 2, and the D-backs stopped throwing strikes. The Phillies didn't make the adjustments. They piled up the strikeouts, and their offense went cold for a couple games until they ended up losing the series. Same thing happened 2 years ago. The Phillies were red hot entering the World Series, and they get through Game 3. They won Game 3 7-0, hit 5 home runs in that game off Lance McCullers. They get no hit in Game 4, and all of a sudden the momentum of the series flips. The Phillies can't score runs, and they're out. The Houston Astros steal the World Series. This season, some similar things happened. The Phillies were 25th in chase rate this year. They started the year a little bit better because that was an emphasis in spring training, was to chase less, but they kind of got away from that, and I think at least partly, at least on one very obvious individual case, it was a matter of thinking too much early in the season. The case I'm, of course, pointing at is the poster boy for the 2023 NLCS collapse. It's Nick Castellanos. He had a great playoff last year, or a great NLDS really last year. He was tearing the cover off the ball, seemed like he was going deep every time he stepped to the plate, and then he all of a sudden went ice cold. And then he started 2024 in a terrible slump. He was brutal in April, and then he got to one series down in Miami in May, starts becoming a little bit of a free swinger, the sort of thing that's worked for him at other points in his career. and all of a sudden he found some success. So when the Phillies dropped in chase rate a little bit, a guy like Nick Castellanos actually started hitting much better, and he was good in the final months of the season, raised his season numbers up back towards his career expectations. But at certain points, and I am talking about that same losing skid I mentioned earlier, where Cleveland came into Citizens Bank Park and won a series. The Yankees came in and swept the Phillies in late July. It looked like teams were developing a book on the Phillies in the middle of the season. And this is something that Ruben Amaro Jr. has also talked about. He's drawn the comparison between the 2010 and 2011 Phillies versus the Phillies now, to where those teams that were coming off back-to-back National League championships were very heavily scouted around the majors. So when you identify weaknesses in their games with all that advanced scouting, the Phillies have trouble adjusting. It's what happens to teams that are in World Series contention for long periods of time. It's just another reason why the Phillies have a window of opportunity right now. That's how pro sports works. The Phillies entered this season with World Series hopes. They might not get too many chances to say the same thing in the future. While offensive volatility, this boom or bust situation, is somewhat specific to the Phillies, probably true with them a little bit more than certain other teams in baseball, a lot of it is just the way that the MLB playoffs works. And that's the second item I'm listing in the reasons why the Phillies won't win the World Series. And I pulled a quote from Pat Gillick. This is something he told John Middleton back when Gillick was the GM. This is from MLB.com. Good organizations consistently produce good teams that compete for and often get in the playoffs. But the difference between getting in the playoffs and winning the World Series is luck. Because to win the World Series, you have to have 25 healthy guys who are playing well at precisely the right moment in time. You can look at almost every season, and there is a team that if the season stopped in July and they had the World Series, a different team would win the World Series than the team that ultimately won it. That's basically saying the playoffs are random. I don't necessarily agree with what Pat Gillick said there, but it offers some perspective. The guy clearly knows a thing or two about baseball, and I think he knows a little bit more than me about baseball, but I still disagree. I think there are certain teams that are built well for the postseason. I think there's certain elements, and the Phillies do have those elements, especially with their pitching. They have the horse at the top of the rotation with Wheeler. They have that loaded bullpen that I discussed in the first segment. And plus, you need to consider good organizations consistently producing good teams. Well, good teams have a better chance to beat bad teams. So if the Phillies were to play the Mets in the first round, say, and if by Pat Gillick's logic, it's random there, that would be a 50-50 series odds. Maybe the series odds are 55-45 in favor of the Phillies, but they would still have a better chance than the Mets. So while I think that quote is a little bit overstated, that's Pat Gillick to John Middleton back in the days when Gillick was GM, it puts in perspective just how fluky the MLB playoffs can be, and I think that's a concern that came to fruition back in 2010 and 2011, those seasons that I had just mentioned Ruben Amaro was concerned about, when the Phillies lost to the Giants in the NLCS, then the Cardinals the next year in the DS. One reason I don't think Phillies fans should fixate their minds on that too much, though, it's true with every single team. So you can't sit there and worry that things will just go wrong for the sake of sitting there and worrying about anything. This still is the most complete team in baseball. Just keep that little caveat that just because you're the best team doesn't mean things will always work out your way and result in a World Series. And that's what Pat Gillick was really talking about. Two individual pitchers that I want to talk about, and then two individual hitters to finish up this section. But the first is a bullpen pitcher, Carlos Estevez. I mentioned him earlier in that group of bullpen pitchers that you should be confident in. But since the trade, since Dave Dombrowski made that big move for a guy that looked like he was going to be the closer, Estevez has given up some hard contact at times in his save opportunities. Also, he lets up a lot of fly balls. If you look at the advanced statistics, and this via baseball reference, he's higher than most of these major relievers that the Phillies are going to use in fly ball rate. And that really doesn't play well at Citizens Bank Park. Just look a few weeks ago at that game where Johan Rojas almost caught it at the wall and it bounced off his glove for a home run. That situation never happens with a fly ball carrying to dead center field if Carlos Estevez didn't have this high fly ball rate. If he gets going, they're great, but I fear that Carlos Estevez has that same kind of volatility that I mentioned with the offense because he gives up so many fly balls, and when you're hitting in Citizens Bank Park, that's not a good thing. Second pitcher is a guy that I think people are going to pay a lot more attention to. And to introduce my concerns about Ranger Suarez, I want to hand it off to Ricky Bottalico because he was talking on Saturday at FanFest about his concerns with Ranger Suarez. These are two different clips I'm going to combine into one. But listen to what Ricky Bo was saying about how much Ranger struggled since returning from the IL in late August.
Ranger has not thrown the ball well in the last 2 months.
That's fair.
And in my eyes, he's the number 4 starter right now on this team.
That's still fair.
So look around, you look at other teams' number 4s, I think we're still okay.
All right.
I don't want to crush him.
All right.
Let me put it this way. As a pitcher, you use your legs all the time. If you watched him last night, he wasn't pushing off. He wasn't driving off of his legs. He was just throwing all upper body. When you do that, it's going to be flat in his zone. It's going to be slower. He didn't hit any of his... Actually, everything was wrong.
Ricky thinks he's not pitching with his legs, which is even worse than a guy not getting into rhythm coming off the IL, because that just indicates overall mechanical issues, and the big thing being a lack of confidence. Rob Thompson said a couple times in the last, month or so since Ranger Suarez has come back that the guy knows how to pitch. So even when he doesn't have his best stuff, he's getting around hitters and he's getting through games. Well, if you have a confidence issue, that's probably not going to be the case. Ranger Suarez is a concern going into the postseason. The good news for Phillies fans, though, trace back to the beginning of the show. He's not going to be counted on that much. I do think they're still going to use him as a starter, but I think he's going to have very short outings and pretty minimal expectations, especially if the way Rob Thompson has used him in the past is any indicator. The final item that I wanted to talk about before I wrap up is the outfield offense. And there's two guys here that I'm talking about. Brandon Marsh and Johan Rojas. Nick Castellanos, I'm very optimistic about offensively. Sure, he had that slump to finish the playoffs last year, but I think Castellanos has really developed as a hitter throughout the year. Rob Thompson has commented on his swing at a lot of times, phrased it saying he's quiet with his swing, meaning he's not moving his head all around. He's keeping his body square and really swinging through the ball. I think Nick Castellanos has shown outstanding improvement this year, so I'm pretty confident in him on offense. The other two outfielders, and I do expect these two to start, Marsh and Rojas. Not so confident in them. Rojas really just doesn't have enough power for me. He doesn't hit the ball hard. He's not going to get many extra base hits. Brandon Marsh, God, this guy just can't make contact. His strikeout rates are too high, and I think the Phillies have lost confidence in him hitting left-handed pitching. So if you see a lefty, you're probably going to have Austin Hayes, so long as he's healthy, starting in the outfield. I don't know how that affects the shuffle throughout the entire lineup, but that's a decision Rob Thompson's going to have to make. So I complimented the Phillies' offense in an overall sense, and I complimented their lineup depth early in the show. That lineup depth is not 1 through 9 because Brandon Marsh and Johan Rojas have not been that great offensively, especially Marsh in the second half. So we'll see how that turns out. Marsh has got some boomer bust in him. Could really prove me wrong, like any of these guys can. And you also have the bench bats that I mentioned maybe come up in situational hitting. Maybe Rob Thompson's a little more aggressive with the pinch hitters than he was last season. But we have an excellent month coming up in Red October. Things are going to get wild at Citizens Bank Park. I hope to have so much to do over the next month between the writing, the podcast, attending games, that I barely get any sleep. So thanks for joining me, Philadelphia. I hope you come all the way through this ride in Red October.